Hello again everyone, it's been quite some time since I make a video about Catalan Opening, so here I am. Hopefully by this time you're still engaged, learning about Catalan, especially since Magnus Carlsen has been playing it a lot since the 2021 World Cup against Esipienko, Nepomniachtchi, and many other great players like Giri and Report. It has got to speak to you that Catalan is a great opening, it's a real gem if you will. Now with the chatters out of the way, today's Catalan shows you a perspective that you probably never really see before in your course of studying Catalan position, for example. But this position started out when black plays pawn takes on c4, and as we've discussed in this playlist for the last 6 months, that white really has millions of options. The world is his oyster, if you will. He can play knight to e5, capturing the pawn on c4. He can play queen to c2, queen to a4 as well, and pawn to a4. So there are tons of options for white here. However, today I'm just going to show you something that's a bit more different in this variation, in which if white plays knight to e5, which is a normal move to capture the pawn on c4, black can play knight to c6, which is the best move at the moment. Again, black could have gone for pawn to c5 and bishop to d7 and whatnot, but they're all comparably worse to what we know as knight to c6, challenging the knight that wants on the center of the board. White once again can take with the bishop on c6, maintaining, let's put it on the board, maintaining the double pawn, and take with the knight to attack the queen and the bishop at the same time. This will be in fine position to play. However, in this variation, we're going to take with the knight, and we're not even going to take the pawn on c6. Although, again, we can. This position, we're going to play knight to a3. We're going to see this variation that can confer some confusion for black if you know this position by heart as white. So no matter if you're white or black in Catalan Opening, you have to know this position or variation at least to maintain equality or advantage, if you will. Now what's the idea of the opening of knight to a3 exactly? The idea is to take on c4 next move. Now let's say if black plays rook to b8, then knight takes on c4, then this knight's already ready to jump in the center of the board. This bishop to take on c6. It is ready to jump to a5 where it attacks c6 as well. And so from here, white has a lot of options. Because let's say if black plays pawn to c5, then we can already play knight to a5, which try to fork the rook and the queen. To mention bishop here e7 as well. So after rook to b6, we can play knight to c6, which attacks the bishop and the queen. The queen moves to e8. We can take the bishop, take the pawn. This position will confer us a great ease in development while black's trying to be chased by all of our pieces. If queen back to e7, the rook will fall. And so black, given a chance, of course, will take on a3. And after the pawn takes on a3, well, what does white get here, right, really? This double pawn is definitely a weakness. White does have the open file, so he can get his rook on the open file very quickly. White can also play pawn to a4, where he flanks the bishop on a3, attacking this long diagonal. That will be fine as well. But we're going to see the general plan of this opening from both sides. Now it will be false for black to play rook to b8, thinking he can control the b file as soon as possible. But here white can play queen to a4, attacking multiple weaknesses at once. And now you can plug this into the computer and it will still say 000. However, this bishop has no scope to develop in general. He can't develop to a6, which is the most active square at the moment. We're ready to take on c4 and a7. Although with that said, we don't want to take on c6 usually, because after that bishop to b7, although being down one pawn, black can consider being equal just because he can get this bishop out. Now, I digress, but in the general, this is not what black wants to do after the first phase of the opening. In a majority of the game, black will play bishop to a6. This has the purpose of protecting a pawn on c4. And so if queen a4 comes again, we are equipped to play bishop to b5, attacking the queen, making it awkward to either come back to d1 or play queen a5, where it does nothing at all. Let's say a sample line for white. If queen to a5 and queen takes d4, we can take this pawn at the moment, because even after bishop to, let's say, e3 or something, we can play queen to d6 with no repercussions in the position. We can play knight to d5, slow play this, attacking the bishop on e3. And if white plays pawn to a4 to attack the bishop, thinking they can trap it, here we have queen to a3. This sort of variation prevents the pawn from taking on b5 because the queen on a5 is hanging. This will be in a great position for black. So queen to a4 in this position is a huge no-no. However, white can play queen to d2. Now queen to d2 aims to come to a5, attacking the bishop in a different way. So after, let's say, rook to b8, because he can play it now, we play queen to a5, Sure, now he can place bishop to b5, but now pawn to a4. Now see the difference here, we can play pawn to a4, making bishop here very awkward. Obviously if the bishop to a6 we just take, because it's hanging, this will trap the bishop. And so as you can see, this Catalan has a lot of hidden ideas. To play this opening knight to a3, you have to be prepared to understand the hidden ideas behind it. So again, queen to a5, we're not going to play bishop to b5 like just now. Obviously we're going to protect the bishop with two moves essentially. One is with rook to b6, protecting the bishop, and the other one is with queen to c8. We're just going to look at the rook to b6, which looks odd because its only sole purpose at the moment is to protect the bishop on a6 and the pawn on c6, but aside from that it's doing nothing at all. But in terms of prospect, black will want to play queen to d7 or queen to d6 to bring the rook to b8 in control, have a full control on the b file, and try to push from there. And so this is why rook to b6 becomes such a popular move, at least, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. This rook to b6 move also has a cheeky plan, in which if white, let's say, play pawn to a3, it's a pass move, right? Black can play bishop to b5 as an idea to get the rook to a6 and annoy white a bit. So again, if white plays pawn to a4, then rook to a6 is a fantastic move, kicking the queen away. Danger level, you can't take this one because a5-1 hangs. The queen has to go back to d2. However, you can take the pawn on a4 already. So this is no good for white. And you know, this rook to b6 line really has some cheeky plan and a sly and evil plan if you don't know what black is doing. Now, knowing all that ideas with the rook coming to b6, we of course try to prevent it with pawn to a4. Now this prevents bishop to b5 because we just capture it. And we also prepare bishop to a3 in the near future, where we can attack the rook on f8. I hope for black you will see that taking the pawn on d4 is not a major advantage because you lose the rook on b6 and that will be terrible. But in general, for black can play queen to d6, where the consensus is 1, it deems that the queen on a5 is very strong, so it wants to trade off with queen to b4 for example. Again, this supports the idea of rook to d8 and or rook to b8 as well. So a multi-purpose move depending on the nuance of the position and also two players at the board. Now it's not surprising that even after move 13 in this position, we can have multiple ways of handling it against black. We can play pawn to e4, we can come back with our queen to c3, which is an optimal square, also preparing bishop to a3 to fork the bishop and the queen. The word has to be skewered, not fork. Heck, there's even pawn to a3 in this position to stop black from coming to b4 that we talked about earlier. But I still think that the easiest way to continue for white will have been to play queen back to c3, throwing all the theory away with pawn to a3 and also pawn to e4. Idea is very simple, to bring the bishop to a3 and to skewer the queen down to the rook. Now the queen, as you can see, we didn't prevent it to b4, so if you wanted to, we can play queen to b4, right? But in this position, we're going to take and play bishop to a3. Continue with the skewer if rook to b6, or in this case, when black can play rook to a4, we can play bishop to f8, the king to f8, bishop to c6. This position has been deemed to be playable from white's side. And with this weak pawn, these 3 weak pawns on the queen side, in general, people will think that this position will be easier to play for white and not pretty easy for black to defend. However, white still has to prove it with the consensus or the general plan of rook to b1 for white, trying to, just double on the b file and infiltrate that way. But the world is cruel, yes? Black does not have to play queen to b4 to trade off the knight. He can play knight to d5, placing the knight on the center of the board, but also on top of that, attacking the queen on c3, making it comfortable to move. Now the problem is, after queen to c2, they're just letting black bully you with rook to b8, again getting all that he wants, while you're having some difficulty in developing. Bishop to a3 is just not a possibility anymore. So in this position, you have to have some guts to take the knight on d5 with the bishop. Say after the queen takes, we still have bishop to a3, although of course the skewer now is gone. But after rook to b8, let's say, or rook to d8, it doesn't really matter. We can play bishop to c5, we can play rook to d1, we have myriad of moves. This position will be considered as equal for black, but still we have some play for white as well, according to our creativity. You can definitely play it out on your own with pawn to a3 and pawn to e4 in this position, but I'm not going to go into that because there's just so much nuance involved in this opening without clear purpose or advantage for white. So hopefully you've been thorough with the move rook to b6. Now I want to take you on another journey to play queen to c8 for black. Now it still protects the bishop on a6. Difference is it allows the rook to come to d8 to probably take on d4. Also one of the finest development there is for black. The general idea will be the same for white though, in that white won't play pawn to a4 to stop anything to drop on b5 really. In addition, pawn to a4 prepares bishop to a3 to put the bishop and harass this long diagonal. And so let's say if rook plays to d8, as advertised we can play bishop to a3, and yes, we're going to sacrifice a pawn on d4, but the general idea behind the sacrifice is that we want to just prepare an open file for the rook to d1 and or to b1. In general, prepare more open file. So in this position already, we can play rook f to b1. We probably will not play rook to d1 just yet, because this will be just a simple exchange for white, with black playing something like queen to b7 very quickly. This will result in the full control of b file. Nothing can really challenge it anymore because of course the rook just hangs on b1. So this will be fine for black. I would say even have a slight advantage for black because he just controls all the b file, and the d file in this position does not have any significant value at the moment. Obviously, if you look at it, because d3 is controlled, d4 is not, but what good does d4 square do actually? d5, d6, they're all controlled, d7, d8, they're all controlled. So yeah, I think this position, they're all very good for black. The defense is good for black, but however, in white's camp, they're not really the case. Now, as far as I can understand, rook f b1 and also rook a to b1 is also a possibility, but let's just go with rook f b1 for a moment. Doesn't really matter because this is a theory known just a couple of years ago. Black here can also have a couple of options as far as how he can continue. He can play rook to b6 trying to maintain stability, declining the exchange. And yes, as you can see, white can play bishop to c5 attacking or forking the rook. But here after rook to d7, you wouldn't want to take on b6 with your bishop, because after then pawn to b6, hey, we have a sexy pawn here, sexy pawn chain here on the queen side. Well, we still have that weakness on the queen side right here. If the queen moves back to c3, let's say, well, I'm just going to use this 4-on-2 pass pawns, a majority to create a pass pawns on the queen side. Not to mention you still have knight to d5, the annoying move from black. So as white in general, you don't want to do that. However, in this position, you still can play rook to d1, trying to exchange off, one pair of rooks so you can control at least one open file. Now, if black really exchange off the rook here, the position is really different, whereby if black plays a slow move like pawn to h6, we can take on b6 and play queen to d2. Yes, we have given black a majority of pawns on the queen side. However, this is, total domination on the d file without queens and rook on them. And this is the stuff that I've been babbling about. It's about the control over the d file and the activity of pieces rather than the material advantage you have on one side of the board that does not really know how to push itself. For example, if you just make a random move, you can play queen to d8 already. After the exchange here, and king to a7, we can play rook to a7, attacking the pawn on a7 and whatnot. We infiltrate, and this will be for the best of white. The other option for black is to exchange off a pair of rooks, and claims that he has an advantage on the d file, but we have the b file control on us. So black cannot play really bishop to b7, let's say in the moment, because not only the a7 pawn falls, it attacks the rook on d4. Black can also play queen to b7 because obviously it hangs, so this is all good for white. But most importantly, black is stuck in this configuration in the near future because obviously none of them can move. The queen move, bishop hangs on a6, and the bishop moves does not have a very good square as well. So the plan here will be trying for black to play pawn to c3 where it can attack on e2 very soon. However, white here has a stunning tactic and just in general trap if black plays pawn to c3 in this variation, so be careful, pay attention. The move is to play queen takes on a6. Of course, after queen takes on a6, we have rook to b8. Rook to b8, and this will be a checkmate. After knight to e8 or something, this will be a checkmate. This will be a trap that black falls into very often. So, as you can see, this is why we control the rook on the b file, or sometimes on the d file, is to hope for the tactic that black can fall into like queen to a6. Hopefully that clears out the matter over here. But okay, play can continue, right? Black can play pawn to h6 as a precaution to play pawn to c3, so not to hang the king on checkmate later on, as we see in this variation just now. Now I want to recommend with white playing queen to c5. This not only attacks the rook on d4 but also the a7 pawn at the moment. And the better version is that black cannot play rook to d5 as he wanted to, because simply queen takes a7, and that's, I think, better for us. We wouldn't want to play on d5 because after pawn takes on d5, that will be a huge center for black. In fact, let's just put it on the board actually. If knight to d7, I don't know, just as a passing move, I don't really care in this position. Then bishop takes on d5 really give black that huge center that he wants. In this position, he also has fixed his pawn chain, so we don't really want to take on d5 if we can. So usually he won't play rook to d5. Now what's different is a lot of people will play bishop to c5 attacking the rook. However, he will miss that rook to d5 as an option. Now this game also occurs in Grandmaster as well, where it just gives white some, difficult problems and difficult questions to answer really, just because do you take or not take, right? If you take, you give black that huge center of the board, but if you don't take, then the bishop will be pinned to the queen, and so that's why I would recommend, or improvement in this case, to play queen to c5 as to prevent rook to d5 in this position. Queen takes a7 becomes the possibility after rook to d5, for example. Now from black side, he can play rook to d2 attacking both e2 and a2 at the moment, but from here even, after queen takes on a7, we can set a beautiful trap. Let's say if black plays rook takes on a2, which is in general and logical move, we play rook to b8 and this pins down the queen to the king. This will be bad. But let's say if black moves his king out of the way first, we're going to play bishop takes c6. This is also another trap in which if black takes on e2 or on a2, doesn't really matter. We also play rook to b8 and suddenly the queen is trapped. So in this position, he has to play pawn to e5 to just get the queen on this diagonal. So when after rook to b8, they can play queen to h3. This position will be fine for black. In this case, I don't even know if black's better already. So again, there's a lot of hidden ideas for white or black that he can make sure he take care of in this position. But if you don't know, and if you don't study this position thoroughly, you probably won't really understand. And I will just say a lot of players have fallen into this kind of trap already. We'll not really play rook to b8 because it's useless. Instead, we'll try to play something along the line of rook to e1, protecting the e2 pawn. Losing the a2 pawn doesn't really matter really, because now we can go bishop to b4. But then after c3, we simply take. And after rook to c2, we can maintain stability, I don't know, with a5, queen to e3, protecting the c3 square. This will be fine for white to play as well. So I've been babbling for tens of minutes, so I really want to finish this very quickly. The thing is, black here can also play knight to d5, but if this position occurs, I think we will have found something like queen to a4 as well. In this position, black can also play knight to b6, protecting the pawn, attacking the queen. Queen to a5, as we talked about in the first part of the video, also plays a fine general role to play pawn to a4 and bishop to a3 next. If queen to d4, we can play bishop to e3, developing the pieces, attacking the piece. We can, just general have a very quick development here as well. And yeah, the game can really continue as one's creativity goes on to the game. But okay, knight d5 is relatively rare compared to bishop a6. And also some other move that can really make the position worse, as we can just play queen to a4 and attacks everybody in this position. And so yeah, I really want to wrap up this position, this video. And so if you found it really helpful and have learned something, I'll appreciate if you press the like button. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Again, link to my Lichess ID to spar with me is down in the description below. See you in the next one. Thanks for watching.